Hey gang, it's good to see you again. Today we're going to take a second glance at the text from the prophet Nahum. I have to confess, this was my first time this morning ever preaching from Nahum, and I can only think maybe one or two other times where it's come up in a Bible study. Buried within this woe or this oracle that's been given to the Ninevites is a history lesson. So the text we're going to take a second glance at today is in chapter 3, beginning in verse 8. And it's an oracle to Nineveh and to the people of Judah, because they're the ones that are reading it. And it talks about this city, Thebes. Thebes is in Egypt. It is about 300 miles south of Cairo. And in the Hebrew, where it's been translated is No-Aman. And No means city, and Aman is the sun god of Egypt, this false god. So this was like the headquarters of their god's worship. This city, Thebes, in its day was just an absolute fortress. It was called a city of 100 gates, which means it was huge. It's also a city that was built along the Nile. The easternmost sweep of the Nile is where you would have found Thebes. And that means one, it's butted against this beautiful, fertile valley where agriculture would have been just prosperous, which means it was a very fruitful and a very wealthy city, which we have historians that have affirmed that. It was also a capital of Egypt for centuries, starting in about 2000 BC up until it's destroyed around 600 BC. Thebes was this place where the Nile River kind of surrounded it. So not only does the city have its walls, but it had almost like the Nile created almost like this moat around the city. It was considered impregnable. Listen to what Nahum says. And he's talking to Nineveh. Are you any better than Thebes that sat by the Nile with water around her? Her rampart, which is like the outer wall, her rampart is a sea, and the water her wall. Cush was her strength, Egypt too, and that without limit. Put in the Libyans were her helpers. Now, not only do we see the rich geography, the Nile being its protector, they had the fertile land around it. They had the backing of all of Egypt, north and south, and then to the west, Libya as well. The city of Thebes was considered impregnable. Nobody could ever attack it. Nobody could ever overthrow it. There was no way it would ever fall. Well, at least that's what people thought. Verse 10, yet she became an exile. She went into captivity. Her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street. For her honored men lots were cast, and in all her great men were bound in chains. You also will be drunken and go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. So what Nahum is saying is, listen, it seems like Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. Assyria is the nation that has absolutely destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And they have done it by atrocious things. They have done it by killing. They have done it by murder of the innocents. They've taken their captives and they've treated them awfully. And they've oppressed Israel. And it just seems like it would never end because Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, seems so strong and so protected and so prosperous that there's no way it could ever fall. That Israel seemed like it was going to have to endure this over and over and over again for some time to come. That's why Nahum says to Judah, well, that's what they thought of Thebes as well. Just a few hundred years ago, Thebes was considered the stronghold that was impregnable. They were considered the world power. They were considered to be undefeatable. And yet, look at what happens. God allows it to happen. And if God allowed Thebes, the perfect impenetrable fortress of a city, to be overthrown by the Assyrians, Nineveh can fall too. It's not a matter of if. It's a matter of when. Now, Thebes was certainly not a godly city, but they never attacked Israel. And in fact, a lot of times they were Israel's ally. And yet God allowed that fortress to be destroyed. Well, Nineveh is now oppressed, attacked. They have been an absolute curse to the people of Israel. And if that's what God allows to happen to Thebes, imagine what he's going to allow to happen to Nineveh. And the same things that the Ninevites did to the people of Thebes, God is saying there's another country that's going to come and do that to you, Nineveh, that's going to cut your children in the street, that's going to overthrow your people, that's going to lay waste to everything you had. And of course, we know that's Babylon, which is on the rise. But the message was, if it can happen in Thebes, well, it can happen in Nineveh. Now it's weird, because this oracle about Nineveh is addressed to Judah, the people of God. Because they're sitting there in absolute desperation going, how could we ever be free of these Ninevites? How could we ever be free of the Syrians? Nineveh is such a strong capital, that nation will never be overthrown. They have political strength, they have military might, and they have economic prosperity. We're hopeless. And yet the prophet Nahum comes in and he goes, you are not hopeless. Because the king of Assyria is not sovereign. The God of Egypt was not sovereign. The God of this world, Israel's God, our God, Yahweh, he is all powerful, he is all present, and he is the sovereign ruler of this universe. So no matter how impregnable, and no matter how economic prosperous, no matter how militarily strong something seems, God's truly the one in charge. And he looks at Judah and he says, just look back at history, what I've done with nations and rulers and cities. I'll do it again. I am the one who's in charge. I am the one who brings hope to the hopeless. I am the one that can knock down any fortress. And I am the one that can protect the vulnerable. That's what the prophet Nahum is getting at in this text. Church, let's talk about some things. It's Independence Day. And you're probably not doing small groups, but you're probably, if you're watching this, you're watching it at home. Let's talk now. Do we ever fall into that arrogance? Do we ever think that we are the greatest nation ever? That we're impregnable, that we're completely prosperous, that we have the greatest military? Do we ever mistakenly put our trust and our safety and our security and our hope in things other than God? I know I do accidentally. And I have to confess and repent of that often. And I think as a nation and as a church, we have to be careful that we don't rely on our government, that we don't rely on our nation, but that we rely on God. Because as Thebes, as Nineveh, if God allows it, any city, any nation can and will be destroyed. And so what we need to do is put our hope and our refuge and our trust in the one who looked at Abraham and said, I will be your shield, I will be your reward. And that's God. All right, I hope you enjoy looking at the text again. Happy Independence Day, and well, thanks for being part of the church.